what if the very word, the word we use to describe our greatest societal problem is actually like actively making the problem worse?
Right.
Like, what if by fighting a concept like supremacy, society is secretly, I don't know, subconsciously validating it?
That's a wild thought.
It really is. And if you are joining us today, you are the kind of learner who doesn't just want to accept the label's history hands down.
Yeah.
You know, you crave those multiple perspectives. You want those aha moments, and you want to get there without drowning in just this sea of information overload. So welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah, it is a phenomenal topic we have on the table today. I mean, we are looking at this linguistic puzzle that just completely flips a universally accepted historical narrative right on its head.
Totally. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore a really highly provocative blog post. It was published today, actually, March 29, 2026.
Hot off the presses.
Exactly. The author is Mark Wells, and the piece is hosted on a platform called Knowledge is King. And the title alone kind of sets the stage here. It's called From Supremacy to Symptom: The Case for White Narcissism.
It's a heavy title.
It is. Now, before we get into the mechanics of this, and I want to make something crystal clear to you, the listener, because this source deals heavily with socially charged concepts, race, historical power structures, systemic hierarchy. We are not taking sides here.
Right, absolutely not.
We aren't endorsing these viewpoints, and we're not arguing against them either. Our only goal today is to impartially unpack the author's exact arguments. We just want to present the ideas contained in the original text so you can evaluate them for yourself.
Yeah, we are acting purely as like an analytical mirror for these source material, just breaking down the underlying logic that Wells uses to build his case.
Okay, let's unpack this. So Wells proposes this massive structural shift in our vocabulary. He argues that society needs to completely abandon the term white supremacy.
We drop it entirely.
Right, because according to him, and I love this quote, language is the soil in which our subconscious grows.
That's a great line.
It really is. He's essentially saying that calling a system supreme does the heavy lifting for the hierarchy before your conscious mind even has a chance to debate it.
Yeah, well, he views the word supremacy as an intrinsically flawed apex word. I mean, when you look at the linguistics of it, supreme implies this objective, finished state of dominance.
Like it's a fact.
It sounds like a law of physics, right?
Yeah.
And Wells argues that when society uses this term as the standard descriptor for, racial hierarchy, it sets up this disastrous psychological dynamic on two different fronts.
Okay, break that down.
So for those who are categorized as white, this language fosters a sort of delusional grandiosity. It subconsciously tells them, hey, you are sitting at the top of a natural, indisputable order.
Wow. But wait, if that's the effect on the group supposedly at the top, what's the psychological toll on everyone else? Like the people who have to use that exact same word to describe their own oppression?
See, that is where Wells believes the deepest damage actually occurs. For those not perceived as white, using the word supremacy harvests this subconscious inferiority complex.
Because they're saying the word out loud.
Right. It forces marginalized groups into a linguistic trap. Even as they fight the system, their own vocabulary is implicitly telling them that they are fighting against something naturally, objectively superior.
Oh, man. So you are essentially affirming the monster's strength every single time you call out its name.
Precisely. Which brings us to his proposed solution. Wells wants to just move away from the ideological power structure implied by supremacy and reclassify the entire phenomenon.
As a symptom.
Yes, he calls it white narcissism.
But hold on, narcissism is a clinical term, right? I mean, it's a personality disorder you diagnose in an individual sitting on a therapist's couch.
Yeah, usually.
So how does he justify taking a psychological diagnosis and applying it to a 400-year-old macroscopic societal structure?
Well, he justifies it by mapping the behavioral outputs of the system directly onto the diagnostic criteria for pathological narcissism.
Oh, interesting.
The goal of this rebrand is to strip the concept of its unearned prestige. You aren't dealing with a supreme monolithic entity anymore. You're dealing with a detectable structural symptom.
Okay.
And Wells actually outlines three specific pillars of this narcissism. First is grandiosity. Now, we generally understand grandiosity on an individual level, right?
Like someone claiming they won the marathon when they didn't even run the race.
Exactly. But systemically, Wells argues this looks like a culture taking unilateral credit for human progress while intentionally erasing the contributions of global civilization.
Like taking all the credit and hiding the receipts.
Exactly. Then there is the second pillar he mentions, which is entitlement.
Right.
On a societal scale, Entitlement is this baked-in assumption that resources, global status, power, that it all belongs to one group by divine or biological right.
Wow.
It's the belief that the lion's share is just the baseline minimum they deserve.
And then the third pillar is lack of empathy, right?
Okay.
Which structurally isn't just someone being unkind.
No, not at all.
It's this profound inability to recognize the humanity, the struggles, or the rights of others. It manifests as policies and historical narratives that completely dismiss the lived realities of outside groups.
Yes, exactly that.
You know, it's like the difference between calling a playground bully an unstoppable titan versus calling them deeply insecure.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, one gives them this mythological, terrifying power. Like, if I tell you a titan is coming after you, you panic. The fear is paralyzing.
Sure.
But if I tell you a deeply insecure person is acting out because they lack empathy, you analyze their behavior rationally, you diagnose the flaw.
What's fascinating here is that Wells emphasizes this is a symptom, not a fixed group of people.
A symptom.
Yeah, he defines it as a contagious psychological state. It's a behavioral distortion that people can buy into, they can inherit it or be affected by it, but it isn't an inherent biological reality.
It's an action.
Right. It's an action-based state demonstrated through a constant need for validation and this aggressive fragility whenever that grandiosity gets challenged.
Okay, so if this is entirely manufactured, right? If it's just a symptom and an illusion of grandiosity, when did society collectively agree to start faking it?
That's the big question.
Yeah. Was there a specific turning point where a psychological symptom managed to convince the whole world it was an objective supremacy?
Wells actually traces a very specific timeline to answer that. He maps out what he calls a 400-year pseudoscience project designed to build a false self.
That false self.
Yeah. He points to the 17th and 18th centuries, right in the middle of the Enlightenment, as the birthplace of this specific architectural framework.
Wait, the Enlightenment. That is usually taught as the pinnacle of human reason and the birth of modern scientific inquiry.
And that is the exact irony that Wells targets. During this period, you had philosophers and these so-called natural historians who took it upon themselves to categorize humanity.
Okay.
However, they did this with zero biological evidence.
Literally zero.
None. They essentially looked in the mirror, projected their own image, and declared it the absolute zenith of reason and physical beauty.
Wow.
Yeah. They constructed a narcissistic false self, completely out of thin air, and then they wrote legal codes and institutions to basically mandate that false biological godhood into existence.
But I mean, philosophical claims eventually start to sound a bit hollow if you can't actually prove them, right?
Exactly.
So as time moves on to the 19th and 20th centuries, the methods had to change to maintain the illusion. And Wells calls this era the measuring tape of arrogance.
I mean, that phrase captures the desperation of the era perfectly. In the 1800s, this collective narcissism needed hard science to back up its grandiosity.
Yeah.
And that's what led to the rise of phrenology and craniometry.
Right.
They literally started measuring skulls to try and detect a superiority that just did not exist in biology.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of that for a second, because the source dives into how those measurements were manipulated.
Yeah.
Because they weren't just passively measuring bone structures.
Oh, not at all. It was wild. The practitioners of craniometry would often fill human skulls with materials like mustard seed or lead shot.
Mustard seed?
Yeah, to measure cranial capacity, which they then equated with intelligence.
Okay.
But the methodology was wildly compromised. They would loosely pack the seeds into the skulls of marginalized groups, but then tightly pack and physically shake the skulls of their own group to ensure a much larger volume measurement.
Are you kidding me? They were shaking the skulls to fit more seeds in.
Yes. They deliberately manipulated the physical data to ensure the predetermined conclusion of their own grandiosity.
That is just straight up fraud.
Absolutely.
And then when those physical measurements were finally debunked, they seamlessly pivoted to the new frontier, which was the mind.
Right.
Yeah.
Moving into the 1900s, they weaponized early psychology through eugenics and heavily biased IQ testing.
Oh, yeah.
The early intelligence tests were fundamentally flawed. They relied on culturally specific knowledge rather than raw cognitive ability.
So it wasn't about how smart you were.
No, they would ask questions that only a wealthy person from a very specific cultural background would even know the answer to. And then they'd use the resulting scores to prove a biological hierarchy.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If you read Wells's historical timeline closely, this massive contradiction just jumps right off the page.
Yeah.
If this group was genuinely objectively supreme, as that original vocabulary implies, why did they require 400 years of manipulated seed packing, biased IQ tests, and pseudoscientific obsession to prove it?
That's the million-dollar question.
Doesn't the very existence of a massive multi-century effort to manufacture proof completely validate the author's point about a fragile ego?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that contradiction is the absolute bedrock of Wells's thesis. These scientific endeavors, they were never objective searches for truth.
Right.
They were elaborate defense mechanisms. By attempting to label the global majority as biologically or mentally inferior, this system was trying to force an inferiority complex onto the rest of the world while heavily insulating its own fragility. It was a 400-year defense mechanism to protect a narcissistic false self from reality.
Okay, let's transition from the diagnosis and the history to the practical application of this.
Okay.
Because if the diagnosis is white narcissism and the history is a fabricated 400-year defense mechanism, what is the cure? How does Wells suggest people actually use this linguistic shift to change their daily reality?
Well, the primary takeaway from Wells's argument is that because there is no biological or divine evidence for racial superiority, any claim of elevated status that falls outside of good character attributes and actual deeds is based on a completely false premise.
Right.
So the linguistic shift from supremacy to narcissism offers this profound tool for healing the subconscious of those who have been marginalized.
But how does changing a word heal the subconscious, like practically?
By completely removing the internalized blame. When you view the overarching system not as a legitimate apex of power, but as a predatory pathology, the psychological burden shifts.
Oh, I see.
Wells argues that the low self-esteem and the subconscious inferiority complex felt by marginalized groups were never a reflection of their actual worth or capability.
Right.
Instead, he reframes those feelings as a completely rational reaction to a diseased system.
A rational reaction to a predatory pathology
Yes.
that completely unburdens the individual.
It really does. I mean, if you are placed in an environment dominated by pathological narcissism, an environment that constantly gaslights you, demands unearned validation, and just lacks empathy for your struggles,
Yeah.
feeling diminished or exhausted or insecure isn't a failure of your character.
No.
It is the natural expected consequence of being targeted by a behavioral distortion on a macroscopic scale.
And the ultimate cure, according to the text, is a return to universal truth. Wells states that true human value is not found in the luck of a genetic draw. He uses this great phrase, through the heart and the hand,
Yes.
character and deeds over color. He insists that by focusing on character, verifiable deeds, and empathy, society can finally uproot this inherited arrogance and plant the truth of human equality in its place.
So what does this all mean for you? If you're listening to this and you've ever dealt with, say, imposter syndrome, or felt the crushing weight of societal pressure telling you that you don't belong in certain professional or academic spaces, think about the mechanics of this linguistic shift.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Instead of putting the burden on you, the marginalized individual, to somehow prove your worth to a supposedly supreme system, this shift puts the burden entirely on the system to cure its own narcissism.
Exactly.
It flips the script. You aren't failing to measure up to supremacy. You are surviving an encounter with a societal personality disorder.
This raises an important question about the broader environment we live in and, how easily we allow inherited language to dictate our self-worth.
It forces us to examine the vocabulary we accept as default. On the Knowledge is King site, there's a recurring theme that ties into this, perfectly summarized by another of Wells' article titles. Truth is a pursuit, not a possession.
The implication being that the moment a group claims they possess the ultimate truth or supreme status purely by virtue of their existence, they have ceased pursuing truth and started defending a hallucination.
That leads perfectly into the broader context of Mark Wells's work, because to truly grasp the weight of this specific blog post, we have to zoom out and look at the environment of the Knowledge is King website around this specific date, March 2026.
Because this article doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly, it doesn't.
So let's survey the host site. Looking at the other articles and videos posted around the same time, we see a really heavy thematic focus on mental indoctrination. There are headlines like, The Invisible Architecture, Understanding the Hallucination of Modern Power.
Yeah, he leans heavily into the idea that modern power structures are largely sustained by our willing participation in their illusions.
Right.
And there are also frequent references to massive global shifts happening in 2026. He dedicates significant space to a 2026 UN reparations resolution and a 2026 UN slavery resolution.
Yeah, he refers to the passage of those UN resolutions as the day the world named its greatest crime.
Which is quite a statement.
It really is. What do those resolutions signify in the context of this linguistic shift?
Well, in Wells' framework, those 2026 UN resolutions represent the global community finally rejecting the supremacy label on an institutional level.
Okay.
By officially classifying historical atrocities like slavery and systemic extraction as crimes requiring reparations rather than just, unfortunate byproducts of a supreme civilization's expansion, the international community is breaking the hallucination.
I get it.
They're treating the history as a pathology to be corrected, which aligns perfectly with his call to treat the system as a detectable symptom.
It's like being born into a city where all the maps are drawn upside down.
Okay, yeah.
For your entire life, you struggle to navigate, you constantly get lost, and you start to believe that you just have a terrible sense of direction. You internalize the failure.
Right.
But Wells is pointing out that you aren't lost because you lack capability. You are lost because the cartography is lying to you. The invisible architecture of the city was specifically designed to disorient you.
That is an excellent way to visualize his broader philosophy. I mean, another one of his posts is titled The Shawshank Allegory, Decoding the Architecture of Mental Indoctrination, and another is called The Gilded Cage, Why We Trade Freedom for Comfort.
Right.
He is diagnosing a society-wide framework that tricks people into complicity. If power is an architecture, language is the brick and mortar.
And he suggests that we are complicit in our own trapping because we just accept the language and the terms handed to us without questioning the underlying definitions. We use their maps to try and find our way out of their city.
Synthesizing all of this material, the core message across his platform is that true freedom requires a relentless, critical examination of the very words we use to describe our reality.
Yeah.
You cannot dismantle a false narcissistic system using the vocabulary that the system specifically designed to protect its own ego.
Which brings us full circle. So let's do a quick recap of the journey we just took through this source material.
Sure.
We started with a highly provocative challenge to swap out the historically accepted language of supremacy for the clinical behavioral diagnosis of narcissism.
And we then unpacked the historical timeline provided by the author. We looked closely at how a 400-year history of pseudoscience, from filling skulls with mustard seeds to weaponizing early culturally biased IQ tests, was utilized not to discover biological truth, but to construct and defend a fragile manufactured false self.
Finally, we examined how redefining the problem offers a really tangible psychological cure. By stripping away the false premise of biological or divine superiority, it refocuses human values squarely back on character, empathy, and verifiable deeds. It reframes the psychological pain, the imposter syndrome, and the exhaustion of marginalized groups not as an inherent weakness, but as a completely rational reaction to a predatory pathology.
It is a thorough, systemic deconstruction of a deeply entrenched linguistic habit. And it leaves us with a really compelling final thought.
Yeah.
If language is truly the soil in which our subconscious grows, as the author states, take a look at the rest of your daily life. What other everyday words, corporate titles, or societal labels have you accepted as objective reality that might actually just be validating an old inherited bias?
Oof, a phenomenal question to walk away with. What seeds are you letting grow in your subconscious just because you never thought to question the soil? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We love taking these complex, challenging texts and exploring the mechanisms behind them with you. Keep questioning that invisible architecture around you. Keep looking for those aha moments, and we will see you on the next deep dive.